and I think takes us back to it sort of in some ways highlights the deep transformations that are going on. And I think from your narratives, transformation potentially in the traditional Hindu mutts, transformation in how farmers are viewing politics, transformation in social structures, family architectures. And going back to where Pradeep started in terms of what we don't know and how these different transformations are likely to influence voter behavior. Ashu, can I take you back to where you left off? That there is a sort of Modi's Hindu nationalism is more populist, different. How do all these social change, how do you interpret that difference in the context of these kinds of social transformations and religious transformations that are taking place? And what implications might that have, as Aditi is also reminding us that the BJP is thinking of fielding a very different kind of BJP potentially in this election?
Populists, I mean, one should not list them, right? So, those who attracted enormous attention, I've been reading a lot on this because in my next book, I will also talk about populist dimensions of Indian democracy, which is to be written in my sabbatical year starting September. Viktor Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, Trump in United States. Basically, okay, instead of and you can talk about the Italian populists, etc. Basically, you get now a fairly large literature on populism in Western Europe, America, and Latin America. The Latin American populism is standardly, normally classified as left-wing populism. And Western European populism, with the exception of the Greek left that came to power and fought with the IMF, is generally regarded as right-wing populism. And the United States has gone back and forth. In the last election itself, we have left-wing populism in the form of Bernie Sanders, and right-wing populism in the form of Trump. Now, India at the national level has seen left-wing populism in the form of Mrs. Gandhi, right? And there are many similarities between Mrs. Gandhi and Mr. Modi, as far as attitude towards the press, attitude towards the judiciary, and attitude towards NGOs is concerned, which is common across all varieties of populism. They don't like mediation between the ruler and the people. It has to be an unmediated interaction. Social media is a blessing for populists because you have 52 million followers. You don't need Business Standard or Indian Express to communicate. You don't need that. So it fits very well with the idea of unmediated interaction. Okay. And yes, right-wing populism is about the left-wing populism and right-wing populism, the way they constitute the people. Who are the people? That's different. And the left-wing populists would generally go towards the following argument. The poor, the subaltern, the deprived are the true people. Right? And some redistribution towards them would define Mrs. Gandhi, would define the Greek left today, and etc. And Bernie Sanders. Right-wing populists define the people typically in majoritarian terms. The people, Hindus, are the true people of India, right? The Roma people are not the true Hungarians, or the North Africans are not the true French, right? Similarly, Mexicans cannot be true Americans, etc. You know, this kind of argument. So you get a majoritarian argument rather than an argument about the poor and the subaltern. And resources, policies have to be redirected towards or to be aimed at pleasing the majority, the majoritarian communities. That's the fundamental difference. Now, the churning in India that Aditi has listed for us from Karnataka, or the churning in India that Pradeep listed 2 days ago and referred briefly to today. Now, it is the reason it's important is that populism typically emerges in conditions of a great deal of churning in society. When the existing certitudes start breaking up, and new certitudes are still to emerge. So this could be because of two things especially, but could be because of other things also. Especially, it could be because of the changing racial, ethnic, religious map of the country, and right wing would focus on that typically. So the idea that according to American census, by 2041, every fourth American will be a Hispanic. 25% of America will be Hispanic, and America will cease to be a white majority country in 2041, 2042, according to American census, generates all kinds of anxieties about what kind of America is coming. Right? Similarly, if you think of Marine Le Pen's argument about North Africans and how many North Africans are there, how many Muslims are there in France, etc., you get the same anxiety about what France could become if not checked. So this churning that Aditi has laid out for us in Karnataka, and something very hard to, she says, very hard to make sense of. She can report it, but very hard to make sense of what's going on. I think Pradeep has some data which he might want to tell you about how the Indian youth are thinking about politics, and how Indian women are thinking about gender violence. What he told me has completely shocked me. He's not wrong. It's data. It's just data, right? He's reporting. He's not saying right or wrong. For example, more than 50% or about 50% of women surveyed in India, this could be lower than before, they believe that wife beating is fine. And it's completely shocking to me, but this is reporting data. The normative evaluation would be, I'm shocked by this, right? But he's reporting data based on a recent survey. So, I don't know whether that means how the youth are looking at how the women, whether that means there's a great deal of churning. Perhaps there is. And in such moments, populism gets a fertile soil. That's about the only thing I can say. I think if we get more data about what the youth are thinking, etc., he has also some data on why the Indian youth would go against Hindu majoritarianism, which was very interesting to hear. Why would they would go against Hindu majoritarianism? They might like Hindu nationalism, but they don't like Hindu majoritarianism. That's an interesting distinction, right? Or that an increasingly larger number of people, young people, are not against intercaste marriage. That would be very interesting too. So I think perhaps Pradeep can say more about some of these pieces of data. But I think the main point conceptually is that India is going through a great deal of churning. Its sources remain unclear. The sources of churning in America are clearer. The sources of churning in France are clearer. The sources of churning in much of Western Europe are clearer. But the sources of churning in India seem to be unclear.
Pradeep, Ashu's done my job for me in a sense by pointing you to what we'd like to hear, but also just wanted to add. So as Ashu says, the sources of churning in India are not clear. And to go back to your earlier remarks about what we don't know, as we try to interpret the next few months, could you point us to perhaps some of the questions that we should be asking, both as observers as well as reporters, that we could think about and have a sort of frame of reference so that we can begin to unpack this a little bit?
Oof. That's tough. Do I have already? No, I need to think, and my thinking is mostly very slow. But before I get to that, let me just say one thing. I found Aditi's stories utterly fascinating. And I think for a very simple reason. And the reason is that for some, I do not understand why this is. I can rationalize it, but I do not understand why this is. Why Indian social science doesn't study religious practice. I don't understand why they don't do it.
There is actually a Vedic university in Tamil Nadu where the dissenter Swamiji is currently on tenure.
On tenure, oh, very good, I like that. Right? That's what I want to attend, a job at a Vedic university, no, just kidding. But to me, and I've said the Indian census, and I'll just point everybody to one fact. The Indian census, look at the data, the numbers have not changed. 1 out of every 100 buildings in India is a place of religious worship. That's more than the number of schools and hospitals put together, in case you really are interested. Even now, when you see these ads for these new fancy new things in Gurugram or Noida, they'll always have religious place for worship is listed among the many things. India is, for good or bad, we are a deeply religious society. But we have spent no time and effort in trying to figure out how that religious practice plays itself out in politics and in party systems, and how, more importantly, as Aditi is pointing out, how the interaction of religious practice with democracy is actually going to change the nature of religious practice itself. We have no idea. And I think that's a great thing to study for anybody who keen. You go around Delhi, you see all these temples coming up, and everything is prachin, of course. Nothing can be here, right? Because new
Government land.
and it's all on government land. What is the political economy? Who's benefiting? Who's not benefiting? Where's the money coming from? I don't know. I've seen no study on this. Nobody. Because for some reason we don't study it, because I don't understand why. Because we are always stuck in these binaries of Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, and that's, if you study this, then you have to be a fundamentalist. The labels are quick and sharp, right? We need to work on these things, but that's besides the point. I think the harder question you're asking is the social churning, and I think what impact the social churning will have. I think in the social churning, and somebody should have connections, I think there are a couple of things happening. First is social media. And we do not know what the impact of social media is. We do know one thing. We know two things. One, Facebook, India is Facebook's largest market. We also know how much this may horrify you, that Facebook is running persuasion experiments in India trying to figure out what works. Whether it works whether they're doing it for political parties or not, I don't know. Maybe they're doing it for the Russians, just kidding, right? Everybody is doing everything for, is the Russians who are doing all bad things everywhere, so I don't know. But I don't know who they're doing this for. But we know that this is happening. We do not know what the impact of social media is. We also don't know what the impact of this massive entertainment media landscape is. I've seen only one study which actually looked at the influence, empirically looked at the influence of soap operas on women's attitudes. We have seen no work. So I think what's happening is that there is enormous amounts of information available, there is money available, and the mind, and I'll say this really cheesy thing, the mind of the Indian youth is opening up, and opening up in very, very interesting ways. Right? And this may not be because of modernization theory, which is, you have to have economic development and urbanization to do this. What social media is doing is it's shrinking the time and space, right? So we can actually get access to all kinds of information, some bad, some good, some indifferent. And I think that is what is going to be, it's important to understand that. And some of this, what's happening on social media is fake. It's false, right? That also plays into it. So I think all these things are happening. And I think I can't say this is the one thing we should do, but I think the one thing we should do short term is figure out how social media is playing and what the impact of social media is. And long term, I think we need to study the impact of religious practice in an era of democratic politics. I think we don't know how that works. And Aditi's example is a great one, where the guy is using the laws of the state against the religious institution, and whether that's good or bad, I don't know. We'll find out. So sorry.
Thank you. Aditi, we have to talk about the social media and the media more broadly. And it would also be really interesting to hear from you, in your observations, the increased use of social media and its effects on party strategies for mobilization, particularly during elections and campaigns. And again, what are the questions we should be asking about this?
Well, I'm sorry, you did ask me
to... And the populism story, it links very neatly. So, as the role of social media in perpetuating this populism will also be interesting to hear.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you did ask me to refer to it, but I didn't structure it properly and I ran out of time. I talked too much. The social media, I think, frankly, it's very important at one level, but at another level, it's also a hoax. Because I don't think it's having the kind of pervasive impact, you like somebody, you don't like somebody, you follow somebody, you unfollow somebody. I mean, it's all right, but I don't think it's such a big deal. I don't think it influences people to vote in a certain way, mimicking trends in social media. It's at best a source of information, sometimes misinformation, sometimes rabid, wrong information. But people are quite smart, and I think by and large, people can figure out, just like phishing mails, what is really true and what is not true. We've had some unfortunate incidents, and those have been, I think, for people at large, learning experiences. So all this current spate of child lifting stories which we're hearing, those must have existed earlier, but we just didn't know about them. And I think it will die out as quickly as it has arisen. This, I think, is a very important element of the whole social media revolution, as it's called. Uh, People of a certain generation are not bothered about social media. People of a certain generation look at it and ignore it. So I frankly am not that impressed that it's going to have a very like transformative effect on Indian elections. It is at best a tool for communication. What is more important is the whole BJP project of Panna Pramukh, which is you make, you go into direct campaign. You talk to the people directly. I found this the same thing when Jayalalitha. I mean, I could not understand how this woman, who used to spend 4 months in the year in Kodanadu, which is a hill station in Tamil Nadu, does not come out of her house, comes in election campaigns, walks like this, stands in the van, introduces the candidate, says please vote for him, and goes off. I mean, what? How does she know what's going on? So the reason I found when I went for her election in RK Nagar in Tamil Nadu was that she, number one, has a plethora of schemes that she wanted to introduce, and every year these would be revisited, they would be refined. This was the sole task of the bureaucrats, and there was a special group of bureaucrats. And then, in addition to that, there was a very fantastic system of cross-referencing of people who are likely to vote for them. Every ADMK cadre had a diary which had the list of all the houses, the names of people in the houses. It would be updated periodically. And I asked one of them if I could borrow it, and he said absolutely not, because it had fantastic data on basically who your constituency is. So, I mean, I could go on and on and on about this, but I think those things are much more important. If you look at Kerala, that is there also the same thing happens. And I think a factoid about ADR data, which came out just yesterday or day before, is quite interesting, which says that candidates spend the maximum part of their allotted 25 lakh or 80 lakh or whatever it is. The maximum amount of money is spent not on social media, not on campaign material, not on paid news, not on any of that stuff. It is spent on travel. It is spent on going, just the grunt work, just the, you're on the road. So I completely concur with Dr. Chibar that, you don't know what makes you win elections. I went to Sivaganga, to Mr. Chidambaram's constituency, after he had been finance minister. His constituency was like Swarg. I mean, it had an ATM or a bank in every corner. Before that, it was one dusty town, back in the boondocks. But here, guys were busily putting in money and taking out money, and like they were really busy. So he won the first election that he fought by a margin of 1,30,000 votes. He became finance minister, and the next election he won by a margin of 3,000 votes. So I mean, what do people want? And rather pathetically, he asked me that question. So I said,
tells you a lot about what we don't know about elections.
so social media, yeah, okay. I mean, I can take it or leave it. I don't think it requires too much research, in my view. Sorry.
Thanks. We have about 20 minutes for questions. So you wanted to say something, and then Dr. Puri.
Thank you, Yamini, and thank you to our three panelists. I just have three short remarks / questions. for each of you. Ashutosh, it seems to me that you could complete the picture you have given using the democratic theory to also illustrate the fact that in the context of India, as also the case in other democracies, electoral democracy does not translate also automatically into democratic governance. And so you've mentioned the importance of liberal freedoms between elections, but it seems to me also that the idea of self-imposed limitations on the exercise of power, self-limitations imposed on the tendency to concentrate power within the executive, the neglect or negation of separation of powers, which is arguably virtually inexistent, particularly at the state level, between various branches of the government, are also strong features of the way democracy functions or dysfunctions in India. And I thought that it would add pretty well to the picture that you gave. Aditi, particularly, I'm very grateful that you chose to mention those stories because they underline very well the paucity of the work that we do on elections, where we try to reduce voters to simplistic behavioral variables, in the quest of explaining electoral behavior, concentrating, for example, on the materiality of exchanges and clientelistic relations between voters, parties, and candidates, or the whole patronage democracy explanations. And as Pradeep also mentioned, there's a complete disregard for all other dimensions of people's existence that may shape, or that actually do shape, their political visions, their world their understanding of the world they live in, and so forth. And I thought these were two very good illustrations. And Pradeep, finally, I guess the question I have is, well, what you said is of course music to my ears, because very modestly that's what that's the project we have assigned to ourselves, to build data set, make them available, and do that collaboratively. But I'm wondering, is the reason why we don't have the data is simply a reflection of paucity, lack of effort, or lack of sharing of existing research infrastructure and researchers? Or wouldn't we be fooling ourselves trying to replicate, even trying to adapt it to Indian context, the kind of inquiry that is done, to build those election models, election explanations? I mean, the whole electoral theory in the US or in Europe is based on the assumption that you can actually link electoral behavior to particular social characteristics. And those of us who've tried to do that, even at a micro level, that through survey, know very well that it doesn't seem to be working. I mean, I work on the Samajwadi Party. It is reputed to be a Yadav party, and visit 5 Yadav households and you have 8 different political opinions. And sometimes within the same families as well. And sometimes it is strategic, and sometimes it is, emotive, and sometimes it is, old family affiliations, habits, and sometimes it's completely random, and sometimes people don't even know, So aren't we fooling ourselves trying to build such an electoral theory for India, knowing that the quest of predictability might be a vain one?
Yes. Qureshi Sahab, then Rachika. We'll take 4 in this round. And
yes. Excellent presentations. A couple of points for Mr. Varshney. You rightly flagged that good elections do not necessarily lead to good democracy. In fact, I came across this concept when I was doing research for my book, when I saw Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index, which rated elections very highly, 9.72 out of 10. But India was classified as a flawed democracy. I was very upset because we were very euphoric about great Indian election. which Hillary Clinton described as gold standard, and here was some journal describing our elections as flawed. But when we looked at the reasons why they categorized as a flawed, we were very convinced because those were exactly the same things which we were concerned about. For instance, the increasing criminalization of politics. Now, in 2004, we had 124 MPs with criminal record. It went up to 162 in 2009 and 182 in 2014. So what's happening? If we are one-third of our parliament and legislators are criminals and multiple cases, and in many cases heinous offences like rape, dacoity, murder and kidnapping. So what do we do about democracy? But one of your conclusions surprised me because you said that richer and the educated people vote. But that is totally contrary to our perception. Rich and poor, so-called educated do not vote. That's our standing ground. We have a regular campaign. Not only they don't vote, they make it a fashion statement. Oh, I've never voted in my life. We said we'll convert it into the shame and embarrassment, and we addressed our communication program. One was the most famous Pappu campaign. We created a Pappu. No political statement intended here when I say that. So, this Pappu, that was a famous Hindi film song. Pappu can't dance sala. So we created our own Pappu who can even dance. He is a smart guy otherwise, but he doesn't vote. We lampooned him. As a result, in Delhi, 14% increase in turnout in one election. That, Pradeep, should answer your question also. To say that why people vote, that needs to be understood. Now, coming to you, Pradeep, why people vote, I would like to say that the poorest of the people vote in India. And why they vote, the answer is very simple, because this is the only power they have. They may have no bread, they may have nothing, but the only thing they have is a vote which they can exercise once in 5 years, and they're very happy to do that. Their feeling of empowerment, that power, that is what compels them to vote. Secondly, without sounding immodest, I would like to say that you have missed a very, very great effort of the Election Commission of a voter education program called SWEEP, Systematic Voter Education for Electoral Participation. We set up this division after some debate and controversy within the Commission. People, even my senior said that educating voters is not your job. I said, it is very much our job because the legitimacy of the legislators comes into play. If you come to power with 15% vote, 85% have not voted for you, then what claim to legitimacy do you have? Therefore, it is very important that we educate voters. We set up a voter education division, and every election after that, Pradeep, 2010 Bihar election onward, if you see the record, historic turnouts.
I want to intercede. No, this is an important point.
Let me just finish. In a couple of sentences, I finish.
No, I want to say this now.
Okay.
Sorry. The reason what you're saying is correct. But let me ask you, may be correct, may not be correct. I don't know. Why don't I know? Is the sweep data available to researchers?
So
do we know what is the data? That's what I'm talking about.
Fair enough. No, I was coming to that. Actually, I would have answered your question. Because we know, but we don't have data support, and we would like to do it now. But what we have, the data that we have, which you make use of. In fact, you'll remember we had invited you to Election Commission to teach us data consciousness. Because we are the biggest generator of data. Finishing. We are the biggest generator of data, but we are not able to use it. And that is what you're giving it back to me. Now, before every election, in every state, we do what is called knowledge, attitude, and behavior and practice survey to support our voter education. That data, we can collect it for our institute and draw lots of conclusions from that. Finally, one more answer, like why women vote in larger numbers. One, that we directly targeted them. Before that, there was no targeted intervention, 2010 onward, and they responded. And additionally, in Bihar, the giving of bicycle to girls has very clearly not only brought Natish back to power, but the fact that women felt empowered, and we see the results. Thank you.
Rajika, I think you had a question. Can we keep our questions short, please?
Just a very, very quick question. What is the role of arm twisting in voter behavior? Recently, a colleague was very, very closely associated with the Karnataka elections, and his response has been that arm twisting has a big role to play, and I was just wondering
in electoral behavior or post-electoral politics?
in electoral behavior, in like voters voting.
We can take one more question and then we'll go back to the panelists.
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, I would like to back up the gentleman when he said elections in India, by and large, nowadays are fraud. That's number one. Why it is one? Because
He didn't say that.
no, so okay, he says that I say.
Nor did I say that.
Okay, no, it is-
Okay,
I
but
say
can
so.
we-
I
can
say
we
so,
get
and
to
I
the
prove it.
question,
I say
please?
where people getting only 50% vote can come to the parliament. Is it not a fraud? I say 85% has no value. Number two,
Okay,
the
just
elections are won on money power and election strategies. That's all. When the people go to poor people go to vote. They don't go to vote. They're carried to voting. They're carried to voting by the thugs to vote it. Now my question, another question for the panel. Question for the panel, ma'am. I know you would like me to carry on. Question is, what is their opinion on proportional representation in an Indian democracy? Thank you.
Yes, I didn't say that the Western theory about the more educated you are and the wealthier you are and the more urban you are, the more you're like. I said that was true until 1989, according to the electoral studies of India. After 89, it's been what you said and what that's there. So there's no. I didn't say that after 89 that's true. Yeah. It continues to be true in America and Western Europe, right? So there is a. The canon was built there, and then those people, when they look at India, say this is really quite different from electoral behavior in richer democracies. Okay. Second, I agree. Good elections don't necessarily mean a good democracy, right? The elections are simply the minimum yardstick of a right. There's not the maximal yardstick, and populists would like to say it should be the maximal yardstick, not the minimal yardstick. Elections are all there is to democracy. And every other institution should attune itself, yours, election commission, your etc., and follow the logic of electoral verdict, right? All supervisory institutions. Elections are fraud? No. Money power carries the day? No. We have very good data on this. And money is used, but now the voter takes money from everyone and goes to the booth and votes according to her desire, her wishes, her perceptions. We can't prove what you're saying through the
I
PR.
can prove if you allow me. If you allow, if you only.
No. You've already said
I can prove it, but if you allow me.
and
Okay.
proportional.
I have the right to speak, sir.
Proportional representation, I think it's a very important question you're asking, whether India should move from first past the post to proportional representation. I'm not sure what we can say in 2-3 minutes about that, right? But we can list for you what my profession, political science, says about the positives of PR and the negatives of PR, proportional representation, and the positives of first past the post and negatives of first past the post. PR is more inclusive, represents everybody who gets more than 5% or depending on, right? But PR does not necessarily make for an effective government. It's more inclusive, but generally less effective. And FPTP, first past the post, is generally more effective and less inclusive. Because you can come to power with 38% vote. In a multi-party contest, 32% BJP got and it came to power. It came, right? Well, I mean, if effectiveness of government, can you take decisions in time, etc. All PR systems, with the exception of some, have, not all, a lot of PR systems run into this problem, which is that when you include everyone and on the basis of that you run a government, getting to decision making is very hard. That's what the literature says.
Can we give a chance to the rest of the panelists and then we can come back to your question?
Sorry, you will detect a hunted look in my face because I don't know which part of the question was addressed to me. So I really don't know. Karnataka arm twisting, I didn't see any evidence of arm twisting in that sense. But yes, there was actually, the places I went to, I found that people were least enthused by Yediyurappa becoming the next chief minister. So they just yawned. And yet, when I went back to the same places after Narendra Modi had been there, they said, "Hum Modi ji ko vote denge." So there was a 180-degree change in their view. So I don't know whether that constitutes arm twisting. I don't think so, but certainly they were ready to be persuaded.
So maybe the campaign does matter.
Maybe it does. I don't know. So let me answer Jill's question. I think what your question you're asking is really difficult, which is, should we be actually be doing this kind of work or should we not be doing this kind of work? And that's a matter of choice, right? Which means, what is it that you want to do to be able to figure out? Do you want to figure out what makes when can an Indian party win an election or lose an election? Do you think that's an important scientific question? You've got to do research on it. Now, maybe I will suggest to you that that's why the coming up with an Indian theory rooted in India is very important. Is that, and I'll say this with due flagellation, if you will, that American academics are mostly concerned with their careers in American academia, where there are fashions and fads that flow following American academia, right? So studies of patronage or group orientation, etc., thinking, this is what works there, so it should work here. I think that is the fundamental mistake we've been making for a long time, right? And I think if you're going to do this and you're going to do it seriously, you need to do it here and do it well, right? And that's why that's all I can say to that. So, is it worth doing? It's not a question for me to answer. It's a question for you to answer. Because these data can yield insights if there's a large enough community of scholars working on it. If there's one person working on it, I'm sorry, Qureshi, just to pick on you just for fun. The sweep data, for example, or the knowledge data, nobody has access to it, right? And the question is, what is the data good for? As a scientist, I would say, do I actually know it makes a difference? I don't know, because two people haven't replicated the same results. So in our discipline now, replication is important. So if you say sweep makes a difference, let's do it. Let's look at the turnout. Gilles should reproduce it. I should reproduce it. It works. If it doesn't reproduce it, it doesn't work. We don't know. Right? So I would really urge you to think of common data sets to be shared by community of scholars. That's all my one-line pitches here.
Thank you. Well taken. We have time for one round of questions. I know Rajshri had a question, and then you. And I think there was a question there. Yeah.
Yeah, so a couple of questions, and I'll be very brief. Ashutosh, I've been following your columns regularly in the Indian Express, and you periodically have an institutional story about democracy, and this is taking on from Jane's story, and I found that missing here, which is not to say whether institutions are present or not, but whether they operate maximally or minimally, and the extent to which democracy itself is impacted because of a certain manner of functioning. Second, and this could be taken by Pradeep or Ashutosh, would be the general fallibility of a causal story. When we try and discover, so the number of times Pradeep said on all our behalf that I do not know. And the reason we do not know perhaps is not because of a general paucity of variables, but because of the weak correlation, even those variables would yield to the necessary outcome of why democracies function or why voters vote in a certain way. I mean, that is perhaps the reason why what was in pre-89, the 22.5% weak correlation between wealth and longevity of democracies, we still do not have a causal story there. We do not have a strong correlation between why democracies have survived in countries like India and why they haven't in Singapore. So perhaps generally a reconnaissance of the limits of intelligence.
Yeah.
I have a question to Professor Vashne what he said.
Yeah.
I have a question to Professor Vashne. I come from JNU. I'm doing PhD in economics. So political economics is what interests me. I'm writing a paper with one of my friends from political science department where we look at, the questions raised by MPs in the parliament. So based on that, what we find is MPs who are non-Muslims rarely ask questions about the Muslim issues in the parliament. So what we find a significant relationship between the questions asked by Muslim MPs about Muslim issues. And similarly, to corroborate our argument about proportional representation system, so we did another study where we look at how the candidates who come from reserved categories, reserved seats, perform in the parliament. So it's basically MPs who come from reserved categories ask questions about SCs and STs in the parliament. And similarly, so what we're trying to ask, what the question that we're trying to ask is whether this system of majority, the Nehruian concept, where he said that majority will definitely take care of the minority when it comes to, the development issues, all the other issues that concern them. Is it actually fulfilled by the kind of system that we have in place? Thanks.
There was one question here, and then we'll take your question. Go ahead.
Pradeep and Aditi, thank you for bringing up religion and politics. So it's more of a comment, not a question. So there was in 1988 an article by...
Mike, sorry.
So, okay. Alright, so in 1988 there was an article by Makrand Mehta in a local Gujarati journal called Arthat, studying the Swaminarayan sect from 1800 to 1840, and Achyut Yagnik and Kancham Shah were the editors. They published it, but then the Swaminarayan followers, they went to court saying this article hurts our religious sentiments, and the government basically intervened saying that yes it does, this is legit, you can file the case. A lot of scholars protested, but I think one of the reasons they don't study it is because of this fear from the community. But I mean, if you have anything to say on how can we do it without hurting anyone here, it would be nice to hear.
I have a question for Pradeep. First of all, congratulations to all the presentations. Are just absolutely fascinating. And more than that, by laying them out in a very systematic manner. But what type of data do you think we need? I mean, let me just say, priority, just giving typology. Are we talking about voting behavior type of data? I mean, in terms of ethnographics of voting and related. Number two, or is it more about attitudes, voter attitudes? Or third, campaigns, like recently there's a study of Macron's thing on how whether persuasion matters or not. Or fourth, the type of other data on polarization and role of media and social media, etc. So there are four very different and very different strategies, very different. Which one would you say do we need? Of course we need all, but how would just related to that, if I could add the Aditi, you're saying you don't think social media matters. I used to think like that too. But let me just say, don't you think, have you read the work of Yochai Benkler, for example, recently? No. But for example, he pointed out, he showed how a combination of social media strategy of the alt-right actually totally affected the agenda-setting role of the establishment press, the New York Times, etc. And in that sense, it functioned as a major amplification of what happened. I mean, I'm just giving as an example. And there's a whole lot of other data. Of course, there's a debate whether social media or other things causing polarization or not, etc. But if social media is disrupting media, if you say social media doesn't matter, then I say that means media doesn't matter. I don't think we believe that. So my question is, how can you substantiate your statement?
Should we go this way?
So, first your question of religion, right, and the tough one. Let me throw it back to you. I think Ashu's spoken of Indian democracy as being illiberal, which is probably correct. But is Indian society liberal? Right? So in other words, what you're saying is that there are people in Indian society who want to use the cudgel of religious sentiments, hurting religious sentiments to prevent free speech, right? So I think that's something we need to think really, really hard about, because, I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong, but I think that's something we should really, really think hard about. And as far as your question is concerned, what you're asking me to do is for the upcoming election, for example, if I was to do something, what would I do? I think I would pick on two things, if I could. Three, ideally, but two at best. One is, I think, what Aditi is talking about, which is the Panna Prabharis and the campaign contact. Does it actually make a difference if you were contacted by a campaign person? Because I think That's, I think, really important. And the very simple, just think of the mechanics. I mean, those of you who care about Indian democracy, let me just take 15 seconds and say something really amusing to you, or sad. An average MP polling station has 1,100 polling booths. An MP is given 2 weeks and 1 car and 3 samosas, if you will, right? And no more to reach all of them. Right? The Election Commission, on the other hand, gives them a budget of 70 lakhs. They spend 4 crores per constituency. What?
But they return half of that.
Yeah, but I don't get. Yeah, I don't get what's going on. So if we think representative democracy is important, you need to reach people on the ground. We need to figure out who is reaching whom and how they're reaching them. That's the first thing. And in that, given the current election scenario, it's a wild guess, and somebody else's could be better than mine. I would focus on leadership and the role of polarizing, rhetoric. Yeah, those are the 2 things. Those are the 3 things I would try to do. They can be done within one study, somewhat separately. And let me answer your question, even though I'm not supposed to. Let me ask you a simple question, and I'll throw the question back to you. What do we mean by representative democracy? Yeah, and that's it. But what are people representing?
People are basically representing themselves through the person they elect.
Thank you. That should answer your question.
I'm going to have to discipline this. No, that's fine.
15% people, those who elect you. 15% people, those who elect you.
On social media, I try not to read anything serious except crime fiction, which is why I got on so well with the Swamiji. So I don't know the theories. I'm being very honest with you. I do not waste my time reading too much theory. But the problem with social media is, okay, some guy tweets, and then somebody else takes up that tweet, and then somebody else takes up that. It's like, people are throwing balls at you, you're standing there, people are throwing balls at you continuously, non-stop. So how much a human being can only absorb so much? And that's why I'm saying that it's very ephemeral. I'm not saying that it's not a factor, it could be, but as quickly as it rises, it also subsides. So at best it's a tool to get in touch with people or contact them. I don't think it has a place in the political rhetoric of, I don't believe that a WhatsApp message will change the way you are going to vote tomorrow. I don't think so.
Will not change the way you will vote tomorrow, but it certainly, there's enough empirical evidence to show that it can determine whether people will go out to vote or not. And different categories of people. I think that's pretty solid evidence.
I'm sure you're right. You know more than I do.
No, I don't know about India.
Ashok, the last word to you before we close.
Ma'am, I ask you a question if you don't mind.
So we are
About the
completely
proportional
out of time
representation,
now.
nobody wants to talk about it.
Offline. We're
Thank
completely
you.
out of time. Go ahead.
The institutional story of democracy, perhaps you're referring to some of the pieces I wrote and argued that even if Mr. Modi were to rise to power, he would be constrained by the regulatory or supervisory institutions. I think that's what you have in mind. And said that the press, everybody in those essays, I said, you may try to manipulate the judiciary, but not every judge is purchasable. You may try to manipulate the press, but the press, which has become so fond of independence, is unlikely to cave. I said all that. Yeah. Now the press is caved, I think, and there are very few left, in my view. Certainly, the paper I write for, I think, has not caved, and television channels have caved much more than the print media. So the Supreme Court, I think it's very clear after the rebellion of the judges that a serious attempt the executive made to bend the judiciary didn't fully succeed. So I was partly wrong and partly right. I was more confident about the ability of the press to withstand, which I think the press has not demonstrated. And I was basically right about the judiciary, and on some other institutions, I'm not sure what else I talked about. I think NGOs I was wrong about. NGOs have been hammered quite badly, and so my conceptual solution, the way I conceptualized looking at the inadequacies of my own predictions at that time. The conceptual intervention is now populism and trying to understand how populists work and once elected. And they really go at supervisory institutions and want elections to be the be-all and end-all of a democracy. They may succeed, they may not succeed. Please note that Mr. Modi hasn't succeeded as much as Erdogan has and has not succeeded as much as Viktor Orban has. They have bent the judiciary fully, both of them, right? And so I think the institutional argument about the institutional constraints on the functioning of the executive remains partly valid. It remains partly valid, not as much as I had thought.
Thank you very much to our wonderful panelists. I think we've had a really rich discussion, and it's left us with a lot of food for thought and a lot of actionable things too. Let's get all the data that we have out there in the public domain for Gilles and Professor Chibber to work their magic with. Qureshi Saab has left, but hopefully he could make an appeal to the Election Commission. Really looking at, I think, one of a really important issue on the interaction between religion and democracy and what that is doing to how political parties are behaving, political mobilization, understanding the ways by which populists exercise their populism. I think getting, really getting much deeper into that will, I think, help us get a much better sense of the effects of populists on institutions of democracy and the impact that may have on future elections. Thank you so much to all three of my panels for giving us their time and laying out their thoughts and giving us a fairly large and important agenda to work on as we go forward. Thanks a lot.